Hi guys, and welcome back to Contract Law. This is video 2 in the videos for consideration. And without further ado, let's continue on with consideration. Jumping back into our Prezi, we've already had a little look at the whys and wherefores. So now let's have a look at the who of consideration. So the first thing in relation to the who of consideration is that we need to recognize consideration must always be bargained for by the parties, okay? Whoever the parties are, they must do some bargaining for the consideration. So bargain, and you'll see that word time and again throughout the text in the chapter on consideration, bargain evokes, I guess, economic theory. And when we were talking about theory earlier, we touched on the notion that classical contract theory was kind of rebooted into neoclassical contract theory, and that's the predominant theory that is accepted by most judges and a lot of commentators nowadays. Now, neoclassical contract theory brings into it not just all of the good stuff from classical contract theory in terms of will and the independence of the parties, of freedom to contract, but it marries it up with economic themes. You've got ideas of transactions and exchange, words that are laden with kind of an economic undertone. So when we're talking about a bargain, we are talking about something that is exchanged between two parties. It has to be of value. So note those kind of economic tones creeping into our discussion here. It involves at least two parties. There will be a promisor and a promisee who do this bargaining, okay? Now, in amongst the bargaining process, the first step that we talk about when we talk about the who of consideration is that the promisee must move some consideration over in return for the promisor's promise. Now note, I did not say the promisee has to move consideration to the promisor. We haven't got that far yet. The first step is that the promisee must move some consideration, okay? That's where it comes from. Now, to tie us and to tie that promisee's consideration into the promise by the promisor, locking it into that particular transaction, the consideration that moves across from the promisee must be in reliance on the promisor's promise and at the request of the promisor. So taking a timeline approach, the promisor makes a promise, it goes across, hits the ears of the promisee. The promisee then, in reliance on that promise and at the request of the promisor, goes ahead and specifies what their consideration will be. Okay, so let's look at the promisee. So to flesh out the idea of who the promisee is and where the consideration has to go, we will look a little bit at the Dunlop pneumatic tyre case. Now, we'll touch on this case at several points in contract law, so this is probably the earliest we will look at it. Interesting little case, early part of the 20th century when tyres were a newfangled thing. And what Dunlop did was they sold some tyres at a discounted price, so lower than their normal list price. They sold those tyres to a third party. Now, Dunlop obviously was very concerned about maintaining its prestige and its trademark, its reputation, and they didn't want the market to be undercut. So what they did was they said to the third party, we'll sell you at the tyres to you at this discount price. However, what we want is not only payment for the tyres, but we want an undertaking that if you on-sell those tyres to another third party, that party on the end of the line, you will get them to also provide an undertaking that they will not sell at less than this list price. Okay, we want to maintain the prestige of Dunlop tyres. Now, there's a big fat query about whether you could do that kind of thing nowadays. In fact, there's no real query. You just can't do that kind of thing nowadays. It's called price maintenance, and you'll learn about that when you do competition law. But in these days of rough and tumble commerce, early part of the 20th century, Dunlop says, I'll transfer these discounted tyres to you lower than the list price if you give me payment for them and promise me that any purchaser of yours will also not sell at lower than this list price. The third party then finds a purchaser for the tyres, and that third party is Selfridge. Okay, now the third party sells the tyres to Selfridge at, again, a discounted price, and gets the required undertaking from Selfridge, as well as the payment for the tyres, gets the undertaking from Selfridge that Selfridge will not sell below this list price. Okay, deal done, parties are happy, and what does Selfridge do? Sells at lower than the stipulated list price. Now, obviously, Dunlop were not happy about this at all. And so the problem for Dunlop was they'd done the deal with the intermediary, the third party. What happened in terms of that on-sale contract, that second contract, and how could Dunlop somehow enforce that undertaking not to sell at lower than the list price? Well, unfortunately for them, the court said that, you know, even if you could kind of, with one eye open and looking at it askew, see that there was some kind of agreement, broad agreement between Dunlop and Selfridge, with, you know, the third party acting as the agent in between, and Dunlop's just kind of this mysterious undisclosed agent out in the wings there. Even if there was some kind of broad agreement between Dunlop and Selfridge, what was the big problem? The big problem was that all of the consideration that was bound up with this promise not to sell at less than the list price by Selfridge went to the intermediary. Okay, went to that third party. It never went to Dunlop at all. The third party had already bought the tyres went on to Selfridge, and Selfridge then promised not to sell at less than the list price and made the payment to the third party, not to Dunlop. And so therefore, because the promise had not been made at the request of or in reliance on anything that Dunlop had done, there was no consideration given by Dunlop or to Dunlop. It was all between the third party and Selfridge. And so poor old Dunlop was left out in the cold, couldn't enforce that undertaking between Selfridge and the third party. Like I said, a bit of a moot point nowadays, because you couldn't enforce price maintenance agreements anymore nowadays, but it does underscore very nicely the notion of consideration and where it has to go to in terms of sealing a deal. Now, that is the usual case in terms of where consideration needs to go to. It normally goes promisor makes a promise, promisee makes a reciprocal promise, and the promise gets swapped for the consideration. Yes, usual situation. There is an exception to that, and that is what we'll talk about in just one moment. The final thing I want to say here is joint promisees. Okay, where you have a promisor making a promise to two people and they promise something else in return as consideration. Only one of those joint promisees needs to actually provide the consideration. The other one can just kind of ride on the coattails there. Technical point, but one worth bearing in mind. Okay, let's have a little look at the notion of consideration moving from the promisee to somebody else, somebody other than the promisor, and yet it's still being good or valid consideration. All right, so here we have another one of those lovely interrelationships between one factor in contract formation and another. So here we have an overlap between consideration and the notion of privity. Now, the doctrine of privity is something we'll discuss in more detail a little bit later. But suffice to say for now, it's a stack of rules that help us work out who exactly is a party to a contract and who can enforce it. In terms of consideration, it may not always be that a promisor making a promise to a promisee wants that promisee to give something back to them specifically in return for whatever it is that they've promised. It may be more beneficial to this promisor to have the promisee provide the consideration to somebody else, some third party. What you see sometimes in the judgments is called a stranger to the bargain or a stranger to the consideration. Okay, this third party out here is getting some benefit even though they've actually not done anything so far as that contract is concerned. So what you might have is A contracting with B, that B will do some work for A, but B says, you know what, A, I really don't want you to pay me. I want you to pay my friend C. That's what I need from you in consideration. Now, when A goes ahead and receives B's work, and A then pays C, that is good or valid or sufficient consideration, and we'll talk about those terms in just a moment, for B's actually performing the work that was specified. That's all good. That consideration and that particular contract will stand as between A and B. There's been a promise and some consideration moved across for the promise. It just hasn't moved across between the two parties involved. Now, whilst that payment to the third party can be considered good consideration in that head contract, what is C's position then as a third party, as a stranger to the bargain, stranger to the consideration? What can they do if they don't get paid? And do they have a direct course of action against A? Can C sue A for not paying them? No, they can't, precisely because they are a stranger to the bargain, stranger to consideration. So Tweddle and Atkinson is just an example of that. And in that case, as you can see there, 1861, we had a fair young man being engaged to a fair young maiden. Everyone was pretty happy about that. You had one prospective father-in-law saying to the other prospective father-in-law, pretty happy about this marriage. Upon marriage, I'm going to pay £100 to the husband, and the other prospective father-in-law saying, I also am pretty happy. On marriage, I will pay £100 to the new husband. It was intended that the husband would be able to collect on those payments. However, when one of the father-in-law, actually, the wife's father, passed away, no money had been paid, sued the executors, or tried to sue the executors for payment of that money, and unfortunately, the husband was a stranger to the consideration that passed between the two prospective, at that time, prospective fathers-in-law, and he couldn't get his £100 in that case. So that is the overlap between privity and consideration, and that is the issue of who in consideration. And again, I think we'll probably end this video here, and we'll move on to video 3, and we'll talk about the what of consideration. So until then, bye guys.